On the 27th of August, 1944, the woods were unnaturally still. Harold Morgan was positioned by himself behind a 57mm anti-tank gun that was oriented completely in the wrong direction. The weapon was aimed not at the road where the map indicated a threat would emerge, but toward the dark line of trees at their rear, into the forest that every officer had declared impassable for armored vehicles behind him. The rest of his platoon was asleep in their foxholes or resting against tree trunks, their rifles slung and their anxieties eased. They believed they were in a peaceful sector. They believed he was being paranoid. Merely a few hours earlier, they had chuckled when he repositioned the gun, genuinely laughed. One of them had remarked, "Morgan, are you intending to take shots at squirrels or at Nazis? Because the front is over there." Harold had remained silent. He simply continued to dig. He had taken out the locking pin on his own, spending the afternoon with two privates and a crowbar to realign the gun carriage. There were no orders, no authorization, just a gut feeling and a deep sense of unease. Now, as he stood alone in the darkness, he could perceive it, a subtle vibration beneath his feet, akin to a massive creature breathing through the ground. He crouched down, pressed his face to the sight, and squinted his eyes. And then he spotted it. There were no lights, no revving engines, only a broad, flat form moving through the trees like a phantom. A German Panzer, and not just a single one, but 6 of them, were materializing from the woods to their rear, like wolves entering through an unguarded back door. The only sounds Harold could hear were the wind and the creaking of treads on the soft earth. Yet, no one else stirred. No one else noticed. He swallowed nervously, drew a breath, and muttered to himself, "You all mocked this damn gun." He reached for the firing mechanism. "Let's see who has the last laugh now." He pulled. The night exploded into a blaze of fire. The farm boy who had no faith in maps before the flames illuminated the Belgian woods. There was simply a young man from Bozeman, Montana, with a father who distrusted plans made by men in comfortable offices. Harold Morgan was born in 1920, the child of a World War I veteran and a schoolteacher. His upbringing was one of wheat fields, tractor components, and the harsh wind that swept down from the Rockies. He was not a soldier by disposition. He was a mechanic by instinct. By the time he reached the age of 14, he had completely rebuilt a Ford engine in his family's barn just to see if he could make it operate more quietly. His father had never talked at length about the war. But there was one principle he always imparted. Don't rely on the map if the road is gone. You chart your own course. Hal took that lesson to heart. He depended on what he could observe, handle, and sense, not on what another person had written on a piece of paper. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, Hal showed no hesitation. He enlisted within 72 hours, resolute in his desire not to fight from behind a desk or at a safe remove. He sought the front line, and his wish was granted. Assigned to the United States Army's anti-tank branch, Hal became part of the 101st Airborne Division. Some referred to it as an elite unit. Hal was indifferent to such labels. He appreciated the equipment. He enjoyed the challenge. But what appealed to him most was the notion of being the individual who could halt the monsters made of steel, the machines that were rolling across Europe, demolishing cities and bones with equal indifference. To Hal, tanks were not invincible. They were puzzles. And he had a fondness for solving puzzles. By the summer of 1944, he had accompanied the division through Normandy, past the hedgerows of France, and into the periphery of Belgium. He had witnessed what a German tank was capable of doing to an inadequately placed foxhole. He had seen men vanish in the haze of high explosive shells. And above all, he had come to understand this. The front is not invariably in front. So when his unit received orders to defend a hill designated as 312, a modest rise near the Meuse River, just north of the thick hoof forest. Hal examined the map, then gazed at the trees behind their position and felt that something was amiss. Everyone else was directing their guns toward the open road. Hal turned and stared into the woods. He was not yet aware of it, but he was on the verge of making the most critical decision of his life. The hill that was bound to fall. It seemed like the ideal defensive spot on paper. Hill 312. It was just an unnamed elevation on the fringe of a quiet road in southern Belgium. It provided a sweeping view of the valley below and the narrow stone route that wound toward Liege, a route the Germans had utilized for years to transport fuel and armor eastward. When the command was issued for Hal's unit to secure it, the atmosphere was nearly relaxed. The tide of the war had shifted. Paris had been liberated. The Germans were in retreat. The universal expectation was a direct advance into the Ruhr. The area was deemed to be secure, but Hal was not convinced. He perceived what the others overlooked. In front of the hill was a wide, unprotected field. That was where they aimed their guns. That was where the engineers deployed mines. That was where the officers paced back and forth with binoculars and cigarettes, exuding confidence. But to the rear, there was something entirely different. Dense woods, matted undergrowth, and deeper within, a barely discernible track created by logging carts decades ago. It was not even indicated on the map, but Hal had spotted it on his first day. He crouched at the edge, peered down that tree line, and envisioned it, illuminated by firelight. "You could get a whole tank platoon through there," he murmured. His sergeant, Andy Lewis, chuckled when Hal brought it to his attention. "Only if they grow wings. That forest is a dead end." Others joined in with their own sarcastic comments. "Relax, Morgan. If the Krauts appear behind us, I'll buy you a steak. Better yet, I'll give you my stripes." Hal did not laugh. He had read a sufficient number of German field reports to understand how desperate Panzer commanders were becoming. He knew how they employed misdirection, nocturnal movements, and unmarked trails, anything to achieve an outflanking maneuver. So, Hal posed the question one more time. "Can we rotate one gun around? Just one? I'll dig the position myself." Sergeant Lewis patted him on the shoulder. "We've got limited ammo and 200 degrees of threat in front of us. You focus on that." So Hal did focus, just not in the manner they anticipated. That night after chow, he waited for the stars to appear. Then he grabbed a crowbar, a shovel, and a bad feeling and set to work. The gun that was never meant to be turned. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun was never engineered to be rotated 180 degrees. It was a forward-facing weapon constructed to be dug in, hold firm, and deliver hell to anything approaching from the 12 o'clock position. Its field of fire was constrained. Its wheels were designed for transportation, not for battlefield rotation. If you wished to face the opposite direction, you were supposed to excavate an entirely new emplacement. That is what the manual stated. That is what the officers believed. But Harold Morgan had never paid much heed to what people said could not be done. So, shortly after sundown, while the majority of the unit was engaged in polishing boots, writing letters, or dozing off in foxholes, Hal began his work. He had no permission, no support, no backup. Just a crowbar, two sets of stubborn hands, Briggs and Carter, two inexperienced kids from Ohio and Arkansas who thought Hal might be onto something, and a patch of earth just large enough to conceal a heresy. First, they removed the front braces. Then, they dug a new gun pit 2 meters behind the existing one, deep enough to allow the recoil to dissipate somewhere other than back into their lungs. Hal measured every angle himself. He checked for lines of fire. He used a rusted carpenter's level from his pack, because in war, a balanced bubble could be the difference between life and death. Next came the riskiest part, unlocking the gun trail and shifting the wheels. The M1 gun was not heavy by tank standards, but it was far from a feather. It weighed close to 3,000 pounds, made of raw steel, and was slick with oil and sweat. The three of them employed ropes, a broken axle, and half a tree stump to pivot it around like some cursed carousel. The process took over an hour. Briggs slipped and smashed his knuckles on the sight rail. Carter muttered curses under his breath. At one moment, the entire carriage almost toppled backward. Hal did not utter a word. When the barrel was finally aimed into the forest, backward, off the map, and against every field manual written since 1942, Hal stepped back to inspect his work. The sightline was restricted. The gun could not swing far to the left or right, but it did not need to. It was aimed at a corridor, a funnel of trees that Hal was convinced could one day be a conduit for death. Now, it would deliver something else. "You're insane," Carter mumbled, wiping his hands. Hal just glanced up at the moon. "I'd rather be insane than dead." By midnight, the task was complete. The gun sat in silence, concealed behind brush, loaded with a single armor-piercing shell. They covered the wheels with dirt, camouflaged the frame, and buried their tools. No one noticed, or at least that is what they believed. The following morning, Sergeant Lewis walked by, paused, and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like somebody's been doing some unauthorized landscaping," Hal shrugged. "Ground was uneven. Didn't want the recoil tipping us." Lewis grinned, but his voice grew stern. "Morgan, don't play cute. You know the order. Guns face forward. That's where the war is." Hal said nothing. Lewis waited, then moved on. That day, the platoon practiced their positions. They rehearsed elevation angles. They drank weak coffee and spoke of how close they were to Berlin. Hal remained quiet. He mentally reviewed firing procedures. He kept one eye fixed on the tree line. That night, he returned alone to the reversed gun, checked the breech, oiled the loading mechanism, and ran his palm along the barrel like a rancher petting a nervous horse. The forest was still, but too still. There were no birds, no crickets, just the sound of wind through old wood. Hal lit a cigarette, not to smoke, but simply to observe how the flame flickered. It barely moved. Dead air, a thick silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. He whispered almost to himself, "If they're coming from behind." He reached down and slid a single round into the breech, clicking it shut. Then he sat and waited. The ground begins to tremble. August 27, 1944. Hill 312 had been quiet for 3 days. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest had vanished. No birds, no insects, no rustling. Just that disquieting hush that falls over the woods when something large is about to pass through. Hal Morgan felt it before he heard it. He was kneeling beside his reversed gun, eating cold beans from a tin, when he observed the dirt shifting beneath his boots. Initially, it was faint, just a vibration, like a heartbeat under the soil. Then it intensified, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. He set the tin down, wiped his hands, dropped to one knee, and pressed his fingers into the earth. There it was again. Not thunder, not wind. Treads, heavy treads. He stood up slowly and scanned the tree line through the gun sight. For 30 seconds, there was nothing. Then a shape moved, just a shadow at first. No headlights, no engine revs, just the quiet grinding of steel cleats pressing through wet leaves. And then, through a gap in the trees, he saw it clearly. A Panzer IV, low, broad, covered in branches for camouflage. It glided forward like a predator, its snub-nosed barrel pointing straight ahead, hatches closed, turret swiveling slowly. Hal's throat tightened. He had not been paranoid. He had been right. "Briggs," he whispered, loud enough for the foxhole 10 feet away to hear. "Get over here now!" Private Briggs stumbled over, still buttoning his jacket. "What is it?" Hal did not answer. He just pointed. Briggs looked through the sight and his face turned pale. Jesus Christ! The Panzer crept closer, unaware that it was being observed. Behind it came another. Then another. A total of 6. They moved in single file with deliberate silence, their engines muffled. A textbook ambush. They had used the old lumber trail, the one not on the maps, just as Hal had feared. "Go get Carter," Hal muttered. "Now." Briggs ran off. Hal remained, keeping his eye on the sight. The tanks were perhaps 200 yards away. No infantry, no noise, just shadows and steel. Hal's hand hovered over the firing lever. His heart was pounding in time with the vibrations in the soil. This was it. No more maps, no more orders, no more laughter. Just Hal, the gun, and 6 Panzers coming straight through the back door. Carter arrived, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Are we waking up the whole forest or what?" Hal pointed again. Carter's mouth dropped open. "They're behind us," Hal nodded once. "Exactly where they said they couldn't be." They watched for another minute, maybe 2. Time felt elastic, stretched thin, almost surreal. The lead tank slowed as it approached the slope. If it crested just 30 feet more, it would have a clean shot at the command post behind them. The other guns, all facing forward, would be useless. Hal turned to Carter and Briggs. "Load armor-piercing, fast. We get 1 shot." Briggs hesitated. "Shouldn't we call it in first?" Hal did not even blink. "If we wait, they'll be sitting on top of us. I'm not asking." Carter pulled the round from the crate. It was cold, heavy, painted a dull gray with a yellow stripe. 57 millimeters of pure defiance. He slammed it into the breech. It locked with a mechanical click. Hal adjusted the sight, fine-tuned the elevation, and took 1 breath. Then came the moment of decision. His hands were steady. His heart was not. "For the record," he said, barely above a whisper, "this was a terrible idea." Briggs gave a nervous laugh. Carter just stared. Hal's finger curled around the firing lever. He inhaled, held it, and waited. The Panzer's nose crossed the tree line, and Hal pulled. The barrel speaks. The trigger snapped forward with a metallic crack. A half-second later, the earth shook. The recoil slammed into Hal's shoulder like a car crash. The 57 millimeter armor-piercing round screamed downrange, cutting through fog, trees, and decades of military doctrine. It struck the Panzer, just below the turret ring, straight into the rear engine compartment, the softest spot on a German tank. There was no explosion at first, just a sudden thump, dull, like a fist hitting a steel drum. Then smoke, thick, black and oily, rose in a vertical plume, as if the tank were exhaling death. The turret jerked sideways. Then the entire vehicle began to burn, not with orange flames, but with blue ones, the kind that indicates fuel. Diesel, oil, and metal, all catching fire at once. Inside, the German crew had no time to react. One hatch opened, and a figure scrambled halfway out before collapsing backward into the inferno. Briggs stepped back, his mouth agape. You hit it." Hal did not respond. He was already ramming in the second round. "Carter, next one now." The second tank in the column hesitated, unsure if what had just happened was an accident or an ambush. It began to turn its turret left, then right. But it was too late. Hal adjusted the barrel a hair. The elevation was perfect. He fired again. This time, the shot caught the tank at the joint between the hull and the left tread. Sparks flew as the track tore loose, coiling like a dead snake. The Panzer slewed sideways, its momentum carrying it into a tree trunk where it stopped, stuck, crippled, a blind beast in a cage of bark. Inside the turret, the crew began to bail out. Hal reached for a third round. "Briggs, load faster. We've never fired this many shots in training." "This isn't training." The third tank had now stopped completely. Its commander must have seen the flames ahead and realized the whole column was walking into a kill zone. He barked orders, and the vehicle began to reverse, but slowly. German tanks were not known for their nimble backup skills. Hal gritted his teeth. "Give me just one more!" But before he could fire, a sound pierced the trees from the opposite direction. American artillery. From the front side of the hill, where the rest of the platoon had their guns pointed, came the roar of 105mm howitzers opening up. The noise was thunderous, echoing across the forest like a god clearing his throat. Shells began landing around the retreating tanks, catching them in a hammer and anvil trap. The Germans were boxed in. The 4th Panzer, trying to turn around, took a direct hit from a howitzer. It vanished in a fountain of flame and dirt. The 5th was disabled by shrapnel, its crew abandoning ship and running into the trees only to be met by American rifle fire. The 6th and final tank gunned its engine and tried to bolt back down the trail. It made it 100 yards before Hal's gun found it, a final shot. The round punched clean through the side armor, and this time there was no delay. The tank exploded like a ruptured boiler, the force of the blast lifting its chassis off the ground by 3 feet. When the dust settled, all 6 German tanks were either destroyed or abandoned, and not a single shot had been fired from the American guns facing forward. The battlefield fell silent, filled only with smoke, fire, and the distant sound of someone coughing through the soot. Hal stepped back from the gun, his arms trembling, not from fatigue, but from adrenaline. He did not speak, did not smile. He just looked down at the barrel, still hot, still steaming, and muttered, "That's why you turned the damn gun." Carter leaned against a tree, pale as chalk. "I thought you were crazy." "I am," Hal said. "But crazy is better than dead." Behind them, the rest of the platoon was scrambling to reposition. Too late. The danger had already passed. The ambush had already failed, because one gun had been facing the wrong way, or the right way, depending on who you asked. An officer jogged up, wide-eyed, scanning the smoldering wreckage. "Who fired first?" Briggs pointed. "He did." The officer looked at Hal, who stood with his hands blackened from gunpowder and oil, his sleeves torn, his face streaked with sweat and smoke. "Yeah. How'd you know they'd come from behind?" Hal did not answer. He just walked back to his foxhole, sat down, and pulled out the same cold can of beans he had dropped 30 minutes earlier. This time, he ate in peace. When the smoke cleared, the fire burned for hours, even after the last shell had exploded, even after the final tank had stopped twitching. Hill 312 stayed wrapped in smoke, thick, bitter, and oddly quiet. It was the kind of quiet that did not feel victorious. It felt stunned. Harold Morgan sat beside his gun, legs outstretched, his uniform scorched, his hands black with soot. He had fired 4 rounds and hit 4 targets. 3 of them were burning just beyond the tree line. One had split open like a can, its tread thrown 30 feet across the forest floor. He had not moved in 15 minutes. Not because he was exhausted, not because he was hurt, but because he did not want to hear it. The footsteps came anyway. Sergeant Andy Lewis, his helmet off, sweat dripping down the side of his face, dirt in every seam of his uniform. He looked like a man who had just walked out of a burning cathedral. He stopped 2 feet away from Hal and cleared his throat. "So, that just happened." Hal did not look up. He was staring at the forest, still scanning, still waiting for another shadow to move. "Yep." There was a long pause. Then Lewis said something Hal did not expect. "I was wrong." Hal turned. "About what?" "About you. About this. About all of it." He gestured toward the wreckage. "I told command the woods were secure. I told them no tanks could make it through. I told you to keep the guns pointed forward, and if you hadn't ignored me, we'd be dead right now." Hal blinked. "So, Do I get that steak now? Lewis almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he reached down and extended a hand. Thank you, Morgan. You saved a lot of lives tonight. Hal took the hand briefly, firmly, then let go. Behind them, other soldiers were gathering, slowly, realizing what had just occurred. One by one, men who had laughed at the idea of a reversed gun now stood looking at it as if it were holy. Briggs walked up and clapped Hal on the shoulder. "Dude, you shot through a Panzer's ass. That should be a medal," Carter followed, nodding. "They ought to rename the hill after you." But Hal just shook his head. "Call it whatever you want. Just remember this." He stood, picked up the expended shell casing from the last round, still warm to the touch, and held it in his palm, as if it were made of glass. The front isn't always in front. Later that morning, at 0700 hours, a report was filed to battalion headquarters. Subject: Defensive Action Hill 312. Time: 2300 to 2345, August 27th. Unit: 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, 506th Parachute. Infantry Regiment. Summary: 1 anti-tank gun repositioned without formal order. Engaged and destroyed. 4 Panzer IV tanks in rearward defensive action. Estimated 32 enemy KIA. No American casualties. There was a line at the bottom of the report. Gun, repositioned by Private First Class Harold Morgan, self-initiated. But when the division's top brass read it 2 days later, they thought it had to be a typo. "You mean he turned the gun completely around without orders?" The company clerk shrugged. "That's what it says." They laughed. Then they read it again, and they stopped laughing. Word of Hal's actions spread through the regiment fast. Some called it dumb luck. Others called it genius. One lieutenant called it reckless brilliance, the kind that usually gets you killed or promoted. But Hal did not want either. That afternoon, he refused an immediate recommendation for a Bronze Star. When the clerk came by with paperwork, Hal handed it back without reading. "Give it to Briggs and Carter," he said. "They did the digging." The clerk blinked. "But you fired the gun." Hal just shrugged. "And the gun fired back. We're even." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Bodies were recovered. Wreckage was mapped. Engineers arrived to haul off the ruined Panzers. They said it was rare to see that many knocked out in such a tight cluster, especially from a 57 millimeter. One captain stood beside the reversed gun for almost 10 minutes, just staring at the trajectory. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. But it did. To Hal, it made perfect sense because maps are drawn by people who were not there, and war is decided by people who are. The mechanic who walked away. Harold Morgan never told his story to a newspaper. He never gave an interview, never wrote a memoir, never once used the word hero. He simply went home. In April of 1946, 6 months after the war officially ended, Hal stepped off a train platform in Bozeman, Montana, carrying a single duffel bag and a folder with his discharge papers. His uniform still fit. His hair was shorter, his eyes quieter. He walked straight from the station to his father's garage, just 3 blocks from Main Street. The sign still hung over the doorway. Morgan and Son, engines, axles, and anything that moves. By the end of the week, he was back under the hood of a tractor. People in town knew he had been overseas. They knew he had fought somewhere in Belgium. But Hal did not talk about it, not because he was haunted, but because to him, what mattered was not the war. It was what came after. Every time someone tried to thank him for his service, Hal would change the subject. When a neighbor once asked if he ever did anything important over there, Hal paused, wiped his hands with a rag and said, "I turned a gun the wrong way and it worked out. That's about it." But that was not it. And deep down, Hal knew. He just did not think courage should need an audience. Over the next 30 years, Hal lived what most would call a small life. He married a librarian, built a modest home outside of town, and fixed engines for farmers who could not afford to replace them, never once charging a widow or a veteran. Every summer, he took high school kids on hiking trips into the Absaroka Range. He taught them how to navigate by instinct, not compass alone. If your gut's screaming and the map says go, he would say, you stop, you look again. Then, you decide. He was not preaching. He was passing down a lesson that had once saved his life and dozens of others. The only remnant of the war in his home sat on a shelf above his workbench, a cracked shell casing, scorched and dented, with a faint serial number still visible. He never told visitors what it was, but he never moved it either. And once a year, always on the same evening in late August, Hal would sit on the back porch, stare into the trees behind his house, and let the silence speak. He never called it an anniversary, but it was. In 1985, a local history teacher tracked Hal down. He had come across a declassified battalion report from the war, an engagement at Hill 312, and noticed the footnote, "Gun repositioned against protocol by Private First Class Harold Morgan. Resulted in 4 destroyed enemy tanks, 0 friendly casualties." The teacher asked if he could bring a student journalism group by for an interview. Hal declined. But a week later, the teacher received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter, a single page. No signature, no return address. It read, "I didn't turn the gun to be brave. I turned it because I saw something no one else saw. I trusted my eyes, my gut, and a little piece of bad road no one thought mattered. If that's a story worth telling, tell it. But don't make it about the man. Make it about the choice." Today, that letter sits in the Montana Veterans Museum, framed beside a replica of a 57mm shell. It is shown to high school students every spring, not because it tells them how to fight, but because it teaches them how to think. What Hal Morgan did on that hill in Belgium was not just a tactical decision. It was an act of independent judgment, of moral clarity, of creative defiance in a world obsessed with orders and standard procedure. He challenged the idea that doing what you are told is always the safest thing. He proved that sometimes the only way forward is to turn around. And more than anything, he showed that heroism does not always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with dirt under your nails and a shell casing in your pocket. If you ask the men who lived because of that night, the ones who saw the tanks burning behind them, they will tell you the truth. He didn't just save us. He rewrote what it means to lead from the bottom. They laughed when he turned the gun around, and for a long time, maybe even Hal Morgan was not sure if they were wrong to laugh, because turning a gun the wrong way is not just a mechanical decision. It is a moral one. It says, I don't trust the path we're all facing. I see a threat no one else wants to admit, and I'm willing to stand in that silence alone until it speaks. That night in Belgium, the barrel of Hal's gun pointed into the unknown, and it answered back with fire, with truth, with survival. There are thousands of stories from World War II, tales of bravery, strategy, and sacrifice. Most are loud, some are famous. But the story of Harold Morgan is quiet. It lives in the margin between the official orders and the unspoken instincts that save lives. It reminds us that not every act of leadership comes from above, that sometimes the one who breaks the rule is the one who saves the rulebook. It reminds us that thinking for yourself is not rebellion. Sometimes it is responsibility. And it reminds us that the map is only as good as the courage of the person reading it. My question for you is this: have you ever seen danger coming from a direction no one else was watching? And when that moment came, did you turn the gun?